Hi everybody, thanks for watching my contribution to the cyberpunk culture Cyberconference. I think it's a great idea to have this conference online. If there is a conference that makes sense online, it is probably this one, not only because cyberpunk gave us a very influential idea of what cyberspace could mean, but also because cyberpunk is used to pick up on the strangest and most improbable contemporary events and explains them to us in an even stranger and more improbable fashion. And somehow, paradoxically, maybe this makes cyberpunk a very interesting genre for futurology or even foresight. And this is what I want to talk about here. Having said that I think it's great that we meet online, I admit I ended up making something very analog. I made a cheap truth rip-off 2020 edition. This zine, a fan zine. Cheap Truth starts in 1980 as a Xerox non-copyrighted 2-page zine, edited and in most part written by Vincent Omni Veritas, aka Bruce Sterling. So here I'll present you my paper bricolage. You also find a link to the PDF of this helplessly anachronistic thing. Currently I'm working on a research project which tries to shed light on the interface between science fiction literature and futurology. And cyberpunk plays a particular role in this current trend. What I am interested specifically are short stories that read like science fiction, but they are equally considered scenarios or sometimes even prototypes or similar tools for thinking about the future. These texts I'm talking about are written either by futurists or by science fiction authors, and they are often commissioned and discussed by academic institutions, community organizers, private companies, but also think tanks of all kinds. Even in Linz, where I work, I encounter more and more people working with scenarios in their research, in the humanities, in their art, in their teaching. So overall, I think this is a very interesting development. Last winter, I went to California and to Arizona to meet people who work in this business. And for the most part, I was very impressed by the outcome and also by the setup of these science fictional scenario writing projects. However, there are some aspects I think we need to stay critical about. For example, to give the impression that fiction or narratives are always something purely positive, imaginative, accessible to everybody, when in fact what we really want to stress with this kind of speculative approach to thinking about the common future is to pay attention to what kind of stories and told by whom we want to see in the world, and we want to shape the world. And also, it needs to be made clear that this shaping process, this influence of the stories we tell on the world is not something straightforward. So storytelling is never an easy solution to a complex situation. And sometimes these projects are presented like this. What helped me to think about all these aspects was, among others, reading the online traces of this cheap truth scene. It picks up the ancient debate of how science-based or how speculative or fantastic science fiction can and should be, and it very seriously proposes a new way to look at the future while not taking itself all too seriously at the same time. And that made me aware of an aspect that is maybe given too little credit to when we think about the reasons of why speculative fiction is having this moment right now. Cyberpunk and SF is generally characterized by a very active fan and critics culture. SF fans fight a lot, so they extensively talk about single texts and movies, etc., in relation to a shared idea of the genre. So besides the fact that science fiction narratives often take place in the future, this aspect makes the genre a very fruitful soil for thinking about the future together. So besides the snotty and sometimes very insolent criticism of cheap truth, it also pushes a new canon, and there are often cheap truth top 10 at the end of the second page of the scene. And in a similar fashion, I made here top 5 of the stories that I read in the context of my project. And these are stories that I consider rather cyberpunky and that I liked and that have been published in a framework that has something to do with futurology. I'll just quickly go through them and then we'll conclude on what is inspiring me in this context. So in a non-hierarchical order, I'll start with Annalee Newitt's All Natural Organic Microbes, published in 12 Tomorrows by MIT Press. It's a story about a very hip fecal transplant cure for rich white people based on the pure and natural excrements of indigenous people, who are, of course, not paid properly for providing their shit. So a very witty story allows us to cringe at consumerism and, in this case, straightforward racist capitalism. N.K. Jemisin's Give Me Cornbread or Give Me Death in A People's Future of the United States, a really great anthology. So this is a post-apocalyptic, completely racially segregated world where dragons are trained to terrorize black communities. However, the women in these communities manage to tame the dragons with their delicious hot sauce and they fight back. Very short, very funny, very sarcastic, but also very serious. And for me, a confirmation that fantasy and fantastic elements are not something that should be excluded beforehand in this context. Tall Tower by Bruce Sterling, published in the project Hieroglyph, which is probably the most telling example of this trend. It's an exchange between scientists and writers that resulted in a short story anthology. The whole thing was initiated by Neil Stephenson at the Arizona State University against what he calls innovation starvation. And while Stevenson's own contribution to this anthology is a story about the Elon Musk-like macho millionaire who inspires the whole world by building an extremely innovative but rather useless tower up to the atmosphere, Bruce Sterling subtly deconstructs this narrative, in my reading at least. He writes about a man who does not want to become post-human without his horse, and Sterling writes about the journey of the horse becoming post-equine. It's a really good story too. Elizabeth Bear, OK Glory. A smart home gone rogue after a hacker attack, and the solution, however, is not to hack it back, but to reason with it. And this accidentally creates a strong AI. It's a really good story. Adam Flynn and Andrew Dana Hudson, Sunshine State. This is solarpunk and it has won the climate fiction short story competition Everything Change that Kim Stanley Robinson initiated, equally at ASU. The Center for Science and the Imagination at ASU was one of the institutions I visited last year, and I met Andrew Dana Hudson, who worked there at the time, and it was very insightful to speak with him and his colleagues at ASU. And it made me realize that even if the rhetoric and in the forewords to some of these anthologies and also the text around the setups of these workshops, sometimes they make you expect something very straightforward, like this is how we make meaningful statements about the future, or this is how we want the future to look like. This is fiction being a tool to build a better future. But when we look at these short stories themselves, at least the more interesting one, it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more subtle. It becomes clear that this building a better future includes narratives that leave room for doubt, for fear, for sadness, and for joy of very small things. So this is why they are literature and not just scenario texts. And also they need room for a certain weirdness, so especially in the stories that read more like cyberpunk, in my impression. So even in this futurological context, there needs to be space to express that there are some things, events, developments that we are completely unable to grasp. And I'll just end with a quick impression, and I'm curious what you think about that. While, for example, the new weird genre or new ecofeminist texts maybe allow us to be in a specific kind of awe in respect to this weirdness, cyberpunk somehow allows the reader to kind of ride this weirdness like a surfer rides a wave. So even if this surfer is not a very elegant figure, but rather very shaky, I feel cyberpunk has found a way of not being all too humble before what we cannot understand or grasp without losing respect and without pretending to have all the answers, and also without taking itself too seriously. which makes it an interesting genre for futurology. I'll have to think about this more thoroughly, but for now this is what I got, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. Thank you.